Well, many countries are experiencing a downturn in their economic fortune, and Nigeria isn't exempted. The country's fiscal position worsened as the cost of debt servicing surpassed government's revenue in the first quarter of the year 2022. Details of the nation's performance in Q1, that's the first quarter of the year, showed that Nigeria's total revenue stood at 1.63 trillion, while debt servicing stood at 1.94 trillion naira. This shows a variance of more than 300 billion naira. Now, the Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Zainab Ahmed, speaking at the public consultation on the draft 2023 to 2025 medium-term fiscal framework and the fiscal strategy paper, also reveals that the gross Oil and Gas Federation revenue for this year was projected at 9.37 trillion naira, and as at April the 30th, 2022, only 1.23 trillion was realized out of the pro rata projection of 3.12 trillion naira. Joining us now in the studio to help make sense of this number and where Nigeria is headed is the founder and CEO, Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise, Dr. Muda Yusuf, also the former DG of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Welcome. Thank you for joining us again.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning.
Welcome, Doctor.
So what do you make of these figures? There's a sharp, well, from our end now, there is a discrepancy. Nigeria was projecting this amount of trillions of naira, but then we didn't get as much revenue as we expected. Where does that leave us, really?
Well, it's a very disturbing situation. First, let me commend the fact that the minister was very open, at least putting all the information on the table. I think we must acknowledge that. Secondly, we must realize that we are heading for a very disturbing trajectory as far as the fiscal outlook is concerned. Because we have a situation where the revenue has not been performing well, it has been underperforming. Because if you look at all the revenue heads, there were very big variances, negative variances in all the revenue, whether you are talking about non-oil revenue or you are talking about oil revenue, independent revenue, and the rest of them. Whereas the expenditure has been growing. And that has been the trend over time. Because ideally, if your revenue is underperforming, you must have a tap on your expenditure. But that has not been the case. The cost of governance has been increasing. Then we have this very challenging situation of having to fund the petroleum subsidy, particularly the petrol subsidy. That again is a major issue for government, and it's neither here nor there, because there are arguments on both sides. But clearly, that is again not something that is sustainable. Then, of course, there are also issues around the leakages that we have been seeing in government. I mean, from all the investigation reports, EFCC things, and the way some very big, very senior operatives in government have been arraigned. We are not talking about small numbers now. We are talking about billions, 80 billion, 100 billion. And you have cases like that across the MBAs. So there are also cases of these leakages. Then, of course, you have shortfalls in revenue, because ideally, as an oil-producing country, when the oil price is going up,
as we see now,
is something that we should be celebrating. But unfortunately, first, because of the oil theft, we are not even able to meet our OPEC quota as far as the oil production.
Still due to this vandalism and the theft.
And that is, creating a major shortfall. And unfortunately, as oil price increases also, the cost of subsidy also increases. So rather than celebrate, we seem to be a victim of the high oil price. So that is also eating heavily into, look at the figure that were presented by the finance minister. For 2023 now, we are talking about over 6 trillion for subsidy. And for even the current year, it's likely to get close to that.
Yes. Doctor, we'll get into all of that. But I wonder if so you think this action is in breach of all known reasonable debt sustainability thresholds on all fronts?
Of course, I think so. Because, of course, there are different metrics, for determining the sustainability of debt. There is the debt to GDP ratio, which the government often use, and which it's often said that, well, if you use that metric, we are within a reasonable threshold. Because if you look at debt to GDP ratio, maybe we'll be talking of something in the range of maybe 25 to 30%, But if you look at debt to revenue, because debt to GDP ratio for many countries is even as high as 100%. But the difference between some of those countries and our own country is that our GDP does not reflect the capacity to generate revenue. Because ideally, the bigger your GDP, the bigger your capacity to generate revenue. So that when you compare your debt to GDP, you can use that as a measure to determine sustainability. But if you have a country where some major components of your GDP are not revenue generating, that will not be a sustainable metric. Because if you look at the breakdown of GDP, for instance, the agric sector accounts for about 26% or so of GDP. The distributive trade sector accounts for about 16% of GDP. By the time you add those two, you are getting to 40 or 50% of GDP. What amount of revenue do you get from agriculture? Practically none.
Despite the investment, despite what the government has pumped into the agricultural sector.
Yes, because first, the agricultural sector is made up of peasant farmers. Most of them are informal. And rather even get taxes from that sector. Government is subsidizing the sector. And it's a major component of GDP. If you look at the distributive trade sector, the distributive trade sector accounts for about 16% of our GDP. Most of the operators in that sector, or players in that sector, are informal sector players. How much revenue can you get from them? So I'm saying this to buttress the point that for our own context, in our own context, you cannot be using GDP as a measure of your capacity to secure debt. What you can use to determine sustainability of debt is your capacity to the revenue that you use.
Which we don't have.
Which we don't have.
We don't have.
Yes. So when you use that metric, you discover that we are really not, our debt profile is actually not sustainable.
But the finance minister, Zainab Ahmed, has said the figures are likely, or will, she's optimistic that the figures will improve in the next quarters. Do you share that line of thought in line with the discouraging factors that we see here now? You've spoken about fuel subsidy payments, vandalism, and the like. Are these figures likely to get any better soon?
Well, it may get better slightly, because the results of company results, will begin to come out maybe around about now, up until June. So some of the tax revenue that are supposed to be remitted will be coming in possibly within this period, that within the second quarter. So that may improve the revenue performance slightly. But generally, the outlook is very gloomy. That is the reality. And I think the minister also hinted at that is a very gloomy outlook. And she even hinted that perhaps most of the capital expenditure will not happen as a result of this outlook of revenue.
So is Nigeria broke?
I would say yes. I would say yes, because if you have a situation where your debt service commitment has exceeded your revenue, that is a crisis situation.
I wonder, Dr. Yusuf, if that puts a big question mark on this particular administration.
Well, it does. It does. But we must also situate it in some context. There are issues that are external. There are issues that are internal. What I mean is that there are factors that you can regard as endogenous factors that you can attribute to the quality of governance. There are factors that you can regard as being variables that are driven by global developments. For instance, We have had issues now with energy crisis. Energy crisis has been affecting a whole lot of businesses. And this energy crisis is as a result, primarily for now, as a result of what is happening globally. This Russia and Ukraine crisis, which has shot up the global oil price, which has shot up energy prices, which is fueling inflation. That ordinarily should have been a benefit for us. But because of the way we have also managed our own oil and gas sector, we have been penalized by it. So on one hand, you can see, well, there's an external factor, a global factor contributing to this. On the other hand, we have been penalized because we have not managed our oil and gas sector properly.
Let's build on that point now, the management and otherwise of our oil and gas sector. So we have a rebirth of the state oil firm, NNPC, now to be privatized somewhat. With this, with the system, with the foundational issues now, do you have hope that we would have less gloomy times ahead in our oil sector?
Well, it's a positive, there's something positive coming from it. But it may not happen in the short term. Because the whole idea of this having an NNPC fully commercialized is to stop all the leakages, all the mismanagement and all of that that has happened in the NNPC. So the trajectory, in my view, is that we have an oil company, a national oil company, that will be decoupled from political interference, that will be insulated from interference from the bureaucracy, that will be a lot more professionally managed, and that will be able to attract a lot more investors. This is a first step to it. It will still take some time for the value of the assets to be properly put together. It will take some time for investors to come on board, whether individual investors or institutional investors. But for me, I think it's a major step forward. And it's within the context of the Petroleum Industry Act. Because the more we allow the political actors to get involved deeply in the management of these institutions, particularly all these public enterprises, the more problems we have. That is what is responsible for the virtual collapse of all the refineries. That is what is responsible. Because how do you allow bureaucrats and politicians to be managing such very critical assets? That is what has brought us to this situation. And on top of that, we have all sorts of dysfunctional policy regimes, which has discouraged investment in those sectors. Otherwise, by now, we should be smiling about what is happening globally. But that is not the case.
Well, Doctor, I was just going to ask, if you say it's in the short term, no, in the long term, yes. The long term, how many years are you looking at? What projections?
Well, I'm looking at least for these things to take proper shape, I'm looking at maybe between 3 to 5 years. 3 to 5 years.
Yes. So Nigerians will have to go through this in the next 3 to 5 years.
Well, unfortunately, yes, because the fundamentals are very weak. The fundamentals are weak. But now we have problem of insecurity, which is affecting our agricultural sector very seriously. It's not abating. If anything, it seems to be getting worse. Then we have some policy problems around maybe our fiscal policy, foreign exchange policy, monetary policy, that can be dealt with in the short term, because policy don't take time for you to fix. If you properly address our foreign exchange policy today, we can see a turnaround in what happens in our foreign exchange environment. If we address our trade policy properly, we can see some impact around the performance of some industries, you know. So there are policy measures that can be taken, which are short-term.
Right.
But if you talk about maybe structural issues like infrastructure and all of that, that will take some time.
So there are so many, layers and layers and layers of this financial situation that Nigeria finds itself with. I don't know if we can accommodate as many as them now within the few minutes we have. But first now to the issue of the debt profile. history has told us, research has shown that the greatest economies of the world have also been borrowers, are still borrowing at this time. But Nigeria has done this, but we are not where we want to be or we expect we would have been, despite incurring this huge debt and even now having to service this debts at alarming costs. So I don't know how we can, do this. Where are we missing the point? Despite these foundational problems that you have noted, have we even gotten the results of the loans that we incur developmentally? If you look at the development projects, have we even gotten that to start with? Are we even securing them, even the things that we have pumped in hard-earned money, dollars into?
Are we borrowing for the right reasons?
Yes, that's a very important question. Because if you borrow and you have something to show for it, it will not have any serious adverse effect on the economy or on the people. But if you borrow and you don't have something concrete to show, then we have a problem.
Is that what we are seeing now?
That is what we are seeing. Right. Because some of these borrowings actually ideally, and this is in line with even the Fiscal Responsibility Act, these borrowings should be used essentially to fund capital projects, particularly infrastructure. Because borrowing should be used to build the capacity of the economy to be able to repay the loan. That is what happens in the private sector. You don't borrow just to be paying salaries and to be paying overhead and all of that. We have a whole lot of that because the borrowing is a major component of the budget financing. Because you use borrowing to breach the deficit in the budget. But if you look at the structure of the budget itself, the current spending is almost 80% or more. Infrastructure spending as a component of the budget is probably about 15%. We have other components of capital projects which are not even infrastructure. People can be buying all sorts of things in the office, building new office structure and all of that. That is also regarded as capital projects. But that may not directly impact on productivity in the economy. So the debt will be valuable or be useful to the extent that it enhances productivity. That is what we are missing here. Other countries borrow, yes, but they use it to build the productive capacity of their economies. But here, the bulk of the borrowing goes into the budget, and the budget is structured in a way that the bulk of the expenses are on recurrent expenditure. I mean, the size of government has been growing. We have been talking about reforming the public sector, cutting costs of governance. Rather than reduce, these costs have been growing. And on top of that, we have problem of corruption. There are all sorts of leakages. If you talk to people in the public sector, they share information. A lot of issues, and some of these things even manifest.
Yes.
Look at the billions of naira that some top officials of government have been alleged to have been involved in corruption.
Yes.
Right.
And those are the ones that come to light.
Let me squeeze in this. I'd like to read something to you because some schools of thoughts have likened this path to that of the Sri Lankan government, which has also been suffering very seriously from economic crisis. The write-up says they believe that this is a game to make the Nigerian government implement globalist policies in exchange for debt relief. Those policies will in turn destroy Nigeria's economy instead of fixing it. So do you in any way suspect any foul play?
No, that one is sounding ideological. It's sounding ideological. Because, I mean, like Ghana, for instance, they have something similar.
Also, they've gone on to apply for a bailout.
And all of that.
Right.
You know, once you run into a crisis and you need a bailout, the person that wants to give you the bailout, you have to look at how you are managing your economy. If you are not managing it well, they will not support it. They won't be giving you money, for instance, to go and be paying subsidy. They won't be giving you money to go and be paying huge overhead in the ministries and so on. They will give you money if you can put on the table specific projects that you want to implement. They give you money if you can put on the table how you want to restructure the economy in a way that you can make your economy more productive. So when you begin to sound ideological, that these are IMF prescriptions, these are World Bank prescriptions, it's neither here nor there. But sometimes, or most times, these prescriptions tend to correct a lot of dysfunctional policies that you have. I mean, they can tell you that, okay, go and review your foreign exchange policy. The foreign exchange policy has created a whole lot of distortions and dislocations in the economy as we speak. You have a parallel market that is going for almost 650 or 630 to the dollar. You have an official rate of about 416 or 420. How do you manage an economy that way?
Yes, I'm just going to squeeze in this because the minister, Zainab, has also projected that 6.72 trillion naira will be, has been budgeted for fuel subsidy in 2023. I wonder what your thoughts are about this whole issue of subsidy. She's optimistic that in June, or there's a plan that by June 2023, probably they'll put an end to this issue or this controversy of subsidy. I wonder what your thoughts are. And then, of course, we are also in a transitional phase. If a new government comes into place, I wonder if these fantastic ideas by Mrs. Minister would be affected.
Well, it's a very frightening scenario. Very frightening. Because if you are not careful, this problem of subsidy and debt service can bring down this economy. It can lead to a total, it can cripple the entire public sector.
So why do we hold on to a policy as risky as this?
No, the challenge is that sometimes you are confronted with social and political variables that can make it difficult for you to take some very important
decisions. Would you hold on to it?
Mm-hmm.
Would you retain the policy of paying subsidies if you were the minister?
Well, it has to be something that will require very robust engagement. First, we're in a transition period. Second, we are dealing with citizens that are hungry. Many people are angry. The poverty level is so high.
Yeah.
So these are very serious sensibilities that make some decisions very difficult to take. But there has to be, something has to give. There has to be more engagement. There has to be more inclusion in the process to see that at least if you can have a pathway in the middle to shift away gradually from this so that the pressure on the economy and the pressure of government will be much less.
All right. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Former Director General of LCCI and, of course, the founder and now the CEO, Center for Promotion of Private Enterprise, Dr. Muda Yusuf. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you very much.